there are already cracks starting to show in the MAGA alliance. And those cracks happen to show up on the issue that Trump has declared one of his top priorities, which is drastically reshaping U.S. immigration policy. Trump appointed to a senior position someone seen as being friendly to H-1B visas, the visas that allow people with specialized skills to work in the U.S. People in Silicon Valley love these visas. They depend on them. And maybe more importantly, the H-1B visa lovers include Elon Musk. But the America First wing of Trump supporters, sometimes known as the nativist right, they do not love these visas. America First to them means literally Americans first, no exceptions. I'm Hannah Rosen. This is Radio Atlantic. On today's show, we'll talk about this MAGA infighting. In the second half of the show, we'll get into what's actually true about the relationship between immigration and the American worker. Because it turns out that even a lot of Democrats don't get that one right. But first, let's dive into the recent news and what it means. To help me with that is Ali Breland, an Atlantic staff writer who writes about the internet, politics, and technology. Hey, Ali.
Hey, thank you for having me.
So, Ali, this fracture in the MAGA alliance seemed to start around Christmas when Trump announced a senior AI policy advisor. Who is he, and how did people respond?
Yeah, his name is Sriram Krishnan. He's this Silicon Valley figure who has a long history. He works in tech, and he was being appointed to be an advisor on Trump's AI team, which is being headed up by another big guy in tech, David Sacks, who's a part of the infamous PayPal mafia that includes Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, etc.
So these are this is a faction. Like these guys are becoming more and more powerful. So
yeah.
Trump's tech allies.
Yeah, there's some different ideological things happening, but for the most part, they're largely on the same page. And a lot of people right now are kind of calling them the new tech right, or just the tech right.
So they're on one side. And then how did the discussion around H-1B visas get going?
Yeah, so there's this provocateur troll in Trump world called Laura Loomer. She's been kind of this weird thing on the right for a long time. She's chained herself to the headquarters of Twitter in protest of her account being banned at one point. But she sees this appointment and she decides to make hay of it. She pulls out a tweet that Krishnan had made about country caps for green cards and high-skilled immigration. And she points to these things and says, this is not what we want. This is not America First. These things are not good for our constituency. And so that's the sort of obvious bit of it. The other bit too is you can kind of see how race is this animating issue in this fight. David Sacks had already been appointed by Trump to be his chief advisor on issues of AI and crypto. David Sacks has talked about H-1B visas. He's pushed Trump on this. He's successfully gotten Trump to say that he would support the continued use of H-1B visas. But Loomer didn't attack him on that and didn't turn this into a huge issue. Instead, she went after Sriram Krishnan, who is South Asian, and I think her targeting him specifically on this issue and associating him with that kind of speaks to the sort of nativist sentiment undergirding all of this. Kind of right after the election, I sort of thought that maybe there was a chance that there was going to be some sort of fractious element at some point in the future, because these are two sides that kind of believe sort of different things. The tech right is reactionary like the nativist right that includes people like Laura Loomer, people like Steve Bannon. They sort of all have this streak of being frustrated with the progress that's taken place in America. They are frustrated with what they see as American weakness. But the distinction is that the tech right also loves business. They love being rich. They love making a lot of money and having their industry be benefited. The sort of nativist right cares much more about the American constituency, and specifically the white American constituency, and benefiting what they see as the natural order of whiteness and the average American, and things that some people in the tech right kind of care about, but prioritize less than their own companies and less than their own industry.
It's really complicated because they both have ideas there's an optimum society. There's a right way that things should be, and then they're slightly different. So what does each side's ideal America made great again look like?
Yeah, I think that on the sort of nativist right, the ideal America is this place that prioritizes, with some exceptions more so now, but fundamentally it's this white sort of very classic, conventional, conservative vision for what the United States is. It's this return fantasy to a version of the 1950s America that prioritizes white American interests above other people. Again, with exceptions. There's These people would all say that they're not racist, that they're just like meritocratic or things like that. The tech right is more agnostic to those kinds of things. People like Mark Andreessen and Peter Thiel kind of to some degree see value in that, but they only see value as far as that doesn't get in the way of their vision for creating this sort of like all-star team of Americans that can sort of dominate the global stage in technology and dominate like economically. And so they're willing to look to other countries to bring people in to try to like get the best talent according to them, to try to like solve the toughest engineering problems and to do things like beat China, which is something that they're all very obsessed with.
So they're less concerned about, where people come from. I mean, what makes it especially complicated and charged that this came up so soon is that it came up in immigration.
Yeah.
Trump has made controlling immigration one of his top priorities. So how did Trump himself end up weighing in on this?
After a few days of silence, perhaps because this was happening literally over Christmas and the days after, Trump did say that he does support H-1B visas, and he seemed to kind of take Elon's side on this. I wasn't super surprised because on an episode of the All In podcast, which is like a sort of who's who of the tech right, it includes David Sachs. Trump was pressed on the H-1B visa issue, and he did say, yeah, like I support it. I'm down for this. This was in the summer. And so it was consistent for him to come back up with this. And the other thing it's sort of consistent with in a sort of like more general pattern-y kind of way is that in the past, when there is sort of tension between his sort of more nationalist nativist base versus the wealthier interests that are in his coalition, not always, but he often tends to go with the sort of interests of the wealthy, the people who have given him the most amount of money, people who he probably respects because he has a great deal of respect for people who have built wealth. And so it wasn't super surprising to see him break that way, especially because it seems like his larger immigration priority is not regarding H-1Bs, and he seems more flexible on that. His larger immigration priority is people who, as he would say, came here illegally and are not quote-unquote high-skilled workers. And so on the sort of issue of mass deportation, this doesn't signal that he's like going to break from that at all. He's talked a lot, very aggressively about conducting mass deportations and quote unquote securing the southern border. And they talk about the southern border specifically because they're talking about a different kind of immigrant and they have a different set of priorities when it comes to people coming across the southern border.
Interesting. So then maybe the thing to explore is the nativist right.
Yeah.
Not just Laura Loomer. Laura Loomer's, a little more on the fringes, but what about someone like Stephen Miller, who will be Trump's deputy chief of staff for policy and who's credited with shaping a lot of the more draconian immigration policies in the last administration? He has solid power in this administration. Have we heard from him or someone closer to power about what they think about H-1B visas?
Miller hasn't weighed in directly on this specific moment and this specific issue. He sort of gave a cryptic tweet that signaled that he is still anti-H-1B, but he's been very consistent on this in the past, and there's no reason to believe that he would change. As someone who is like motivated primarily by this sort of nativist perspective that is, again, like sort of galvanized by racial animus and in many cases just outright racism, I don't think he'll change his perspective, and he's going to fight on this. And so there's going to be weird tension moving forward. Elon seemed to I don't want to say he walked back from this position, but like after a few days of fighting, he did seem to try to like want to soften the blows and sort of extend an olive branch. People in sort of fairly influential but niche figures in this sort of like nationalist reactionary wing of the party also tried to sort of smooth over the tension and make it seem like there was like common cause being found. And so they have an interest among themselves in trying to come together and paint themselves as a united front and sort of like reach a consensus on this.
Yeah, I mean, it's still early. He hasn't even taken office yet. Yeah. But could you imagine a universe where then it just moves forward and we quietly make an exception for elite workers and do mass deportations for everyone else? Like, is that where immigration policy could land?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that from my perspective and the things I pay attention to, that seems exactly the direction it's going to go in. The tech right is aware of the mass deportations, has not really talked out against them. Elon Musk has tweeted acknowledging them and sees them as an inevitability that he doesn't seem to have a clear problem with. That could change when we sort of get like harrowing images of ICE conducting raids and things like that. But right now, that's the track that we're on.
So if what you said is true, and if the past history holds, he is going to make an exception for elite immigrant workers, what does that imply about how he might handle other economic issues?
Yeah, that if we extrapolate this out, which we can both from this example, but then also from how 2016 through 2020 went, Trump is probably going to side, I guess, with more of the wealthier faction, which includes the tech right, which includes people in his coalition who are people like the hedge fund manager, Scott Bessent, who also sort of have this prioritization of more like economically laissez-faire issues. They have this sort of more traditional conservative perspective on economics, and that's something that's going to run into tension with what the nationalists want. They want this sort of economic nationalist perspective that is a departure from this hyper free market sort of way of viewing the world that's been the dominant conservative perspective for the past several decades.
So essentially, this rift that you pointed out in the MAGA world between, is he going to take the side of the elites or is he going to take the side of all the workers, even if that means the nativist right? That's a rift you can track kind of up and down various issues for the next many years, just to see, okay, whose side does he take on a lot of these issues?
Exactly, yeah. AI and automation is going to be a really big one in this area too, because like the tech right obviously cares a lot about AI and automation. They're very pro AI and automation. They see this as like an existential issue in the United States versus China, and that the US must, to continue like its being like the most important country in the world, that must beat China on this. But a lot of the sort of more nationalist right doesn't agree with this. They see this as like a different kind of issue. Tucker Carlson, who I think kind of squarely falls in this nativist camp and is one of its most influential members, has outright said that he opposes not necessarily the development of AI and automation, but its implementation and use. He's talked directly about never using AI for like things like driverless trucks, but Elon at Tesla is directly like making self-driving trucks. And so, yeah, there's a lot of like weird places where these sort of fractures are going to play out.
And Tucker Carlson takes that issue because it's a betrayal of the American worker.
Precisely.
Interesting. So this is the central fissure of the Trump administration.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like that. I do want to say that this is kind of a unique issue in that it draws in race, which is a very big thing, and it draws in immigration. And so it might get a uniquely high amount of attention, but there's still going to be versions of this fight that might not play out as aggressively that are going to happen over the next 4 years.
Well, Ali, thank you for pointing out this line to us. We'll be watching it for the next 4 years, and thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
After the break, we explore what's behind the politics. Trump and his allies made the argument often in the campaign that immigrants take away jobs from Americans. It's an argument that on the surface has some intuitive logic, but it actually doesn't work like that. More soon. Joining me is Atlantic staff writer Rogé Karma, who mainly covers economics. Rogé, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Sure. So an early rift broke out in the Trump administration over H-1B visas, which we've been discussing on this show. With the nativist right saying what people say about all kinds of immigration, these immigrants take jobs away from American workers. So what do we know about the relationship between H-1B visa holders and the American worker?
Well, luckily, the H-1B program allocates workers randomly to companies based on a lottery. And that allows researchers to study what actually happens to the companies that did get workers as opposed to the companies that didn't. And I agree with you. I think there's a real sort of man-on-the-street argument. There's a sort of view that there's a fixed pool of jobs, and so any immigrant that we bring in is going to take away a job that would otherwise go to an American. But when researchers have looked at this, the overwhelming majority of the studies have actually found no negative impact on either employment or wages, which I think at first sounds a little bit counterintuitive. But the reason is a fewfold. One, companies who get H-1B workers actually end up growing and scaling up faster than the companies who don't. And then because of that, they have to then hire a bunch of more native-born workers around that immigrant. The second reason is innovation. One of my favorite statistics comes from Jeremy Newfield, who's a fellow at the Institute for Progress. And he pointed out that 30% of U.S. patents, almost 40% of U.S. Nobel Prizes in science, and more than 50% of billion-dollar U.S. startups belong to immigrants. Now, not all of those are H-1B holders, but there's a lot of evidence that the companies who are awarded H-1B visas, they produce more patents, more new products, get more VC funding, and all of that actually creates jobs. So on the whole, I actually don't think there's a lot of evidence for this broader nativist claim about this program.
Let's make this a little more concrete. So let's just play out a theoretical company. Here's a theoretical company, hires H-1B visa holders. How does it work? Like, innovation is a vague word. How does it actually play out?
I think what's important to remember here is that getting one of these H-1B visas is actually pretty difficult. And so the idea that a company is going to be able to systematically bring in foreign workers to replace their native ones using this program, it's just really hard to do because there's such a low chance they're even going to get those workers in the first place. And so a lot of times when companies use this program, what they're doing is they're looking for a very important skill set. So let's use semiconductors as an example. This is an industry, when it comes to the manufacturing of semiconductors, that U.S. companies haven't really done for a while. A lot of the most advanced chips are made in places like Taiwan, and so a lot of the best talent is abroad. And so if you're a U.S. semiconductor manufacturer, the industry in the U.S. estimates that even if we had the best job training programs possible, that would only fill about 50% of the high-skilled demand for the labor force in this field. And so you need to bring in folks who have this highly specialized knowledge, probably because they've worked in other countries. But then what that allows you to do, once you have a subset of foreign-born workers who can do this sort of specialized manufacturing, what you then have is then you have people to come in and support around them. And then because a company has that need met, they're able to then hire a bunch of other workers to fill other needs that they have, but that don't require that same kind of specialized knowledge. And on the other flip side is that we actually have some studies that look at what happens to the companies that don't get H-1B visas. What happens to those companies? Do they hire more native workers? Do they invest in more job training? And it turns out that they don't. In fact, they end up often just either A, producing less or growing less quickly, or B, and this is a finding of a lot of the recent literature, they end up outsourcing the jobs instead. And so instead of, bringing in this new worker and then hiring more native workers around them, they just say, well, look, we have an office in China, or we have an office in Singapore, or we have an office in Hong Kong or India. Let's just hire more there because we're not going to be able to get the talent that we need here. There are a handful of outlier studies, but I think right now the broad consensus in the field is that the H-1B program, even for all its flaws, doesn't seem to have these negative employment or wage effects.
So that's what the research shows. It's fairly definitive until now. And yet even some Democrats have repeated the line, the H-1B visas take away American jobs. For example, Bernie Sanders. What do you make of that?
Well, I think where Bernie's coming from, and I think where a lot of Democrats are coming from, and quite frankly, some Republicans, is that there are two things that are true here at once. The first thing that's true is that we don't find these huge negative effects from the H-1B program. And the second thing that's also true is that despite that, the H-1B program has a lot of flaws, a lot of loopholes that companies have learned how to game. So one of these is that a significant portion of H-1B visas are used by so-called outsourcing firms, which are these companies that basically bring in foreign workers, they train them here, and then when their H-1B visa expires, they employ them in their home countries for a fraction of the cost. And so they're functionally using the H-1B visa to train workers here and then employ them at lower labor costs elsewhere. That's just bad on the face of it. The fact that we still don't see negative effects overall is really telling, but we should fix that loophole, by, among other things, raising the minimum wage for H-1B visa holders, making the program merit-based instead of random. You can more closely regulate how companies use those workers. So I think part of what Bernie Sanders is getting at, part of what some of these critiques are getting at, is that this program does have a lot of flaws that allow corporations to game it. And it's actually kind of shocking that despite all these flaws, it still hasn't produced these horribly negative results. But imagine how much better it could be if we fix them. So I really think that this might be a place where you see the sort of messy realities of immigration politics running up against what really people all across the political spectrum agree is a pretty common sense set of reforms. But that doesn't always mean it makes good politics.
Right. Okay, so we've been talking exclusively about the H-1B visas because they came up in the news. But the whole of Trump's promise is not specifically about H-1B visas at all. It's a promise of mass deportation and immigrant labor in general. I know that you've been looking into the research about the relationship between immigrant labor and the American worker. What did you find?
Well, I went into this because I kept hearing, right, Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, Stephen Miller make these kind of claims that sound kind of intuitive, right? That when immigrants come in, they take jobs from natives, right? There's a sort of Econ 101 logic which says when the supply of any good goes up, including labor, the price of that good, like wages, goes down. And so I kept hearing these arguments and thinking, well, like maybe there's something to this. And so let's like actually look at what is happening. And it turns out that the sort of Trump-Vance view was pretty much the conventional wisdom for most of the 20th century, both among policymakers and economists, until a study came along that sort of shattered the consensus. And so to tell you about the study, I'm gonna go back a little bit. So in 1980, Fidel Castro, the president of Cuba, opened up emigration from his country. He lifted the ban on emigration. And what that allowed is for 125,000 Cubans to leave from Mariel Harbor to Miami, Florida, an event that ended up becoming known as the Mariel Boat Lift. And in just a few short months, Miami's workforce expands by about 25 times as much as the U.S. workforce expands every year because of immigration. And this created the perfect conditions for what economists call a natural experiment. It was like this big, massive shock that only happened to Miami. And so what the economist David Card later realized is that you could compare what happened to workers in Miami to workers in other cities that had not experienced the boat lift, track how wages did in both, and then see like what actually happened. And his view was, look, if there is a negative effect of immigration on wages, Miami in the 1980s is exactly where it should show up. It's this big, unprecedented shock. That makes what he ended up finding so shocking, because he ends up finding that this huge influx of immigrants has virtually no effect on both employment or wages of native-born workers in Miami, including those without a college degree.
And why? I mean, it seems counterintuitive.
It seems completely counterintuitive. There are a few reasons, but I think the big one and the big thing that the common sense view of immigration misses is that immigrants aren't just workers. They're also consumers. You know, they're people who buy things like healthcare and housing and groceries. And so at the same time that they're, competing with Americans for jobs, they're also buying lots of things that then increase the need for more jobs. And I think this sounds counterintuitive, but we think about it in other contexts all the time, right? When's the last time you heard a Republican politician railing against the upcoming group of high school graduates because they were about to come in and compete with, people currently in the workforce?
Right.
You probably haven't, because we understand that population growth has these two sides to it, that people are consumers who create demand for jobs and workers who take jobs. And so I think that's the gist of the problem with the conventional view.
So that was a singular study. Has that held up over time?
It has. And so after that study, it got a lot of researchers interested. And this has now been studied in countries all over the world, from Israel to Denmark to Portugal to France. And almost all of the high-quality studies come back with very similar results. I think the one complication in all of this, the one challenge has been, well, what about the least skilled workers? What about, okay, maybe on average, immigrants don't hurt the employment prospects or the wages of native-born workers. But what about the least skilled workers? What about high school dropouts, folks without a high school diploma? And a lot of the more recent literature has shown that even that group doesn't suffer when immigrants come in. And so I think the broad consensus in the literature now is that, right, immigration does have costs. It can exacerbate inequality. Tellingly, the wages of other immigrants often get hurt by new immigration. You could see some negative effects in certain sectors, even if it's balanced out by other sectors. But on the whole, it appears to be really beneficial for basically all classes of native workers.
So at this point, there's a large body of research saying the arrival of immigrants, even sudden arrival of immigrants, doesn't have a great effect on the American worker, may even have a positive effect. Now, what about the disappearance of immigrant labor? Because Trump's promises mass deportations. I'm not sure if you can just flip, the findings of this research. Like, is there a similar natural experiment or study that shows how that might affect workers or the economy?
There is actually. And I think the claim from Trump and his advisors is that the ultimate pro-worker policy is mass deportation, right? Because what happens when you get rid of a bunch of immigrant laborers? Now those employers have to hire natives at higher wages because there's a sort of artificially created labor shortage.
Right.
And again, very intuitive. But when we actually look at what happens in the real world, we see something very different. So the best study on this, I think, although there's a few, is from the Secure Communities Program, which is a Department of Homeland Security program that between 2008 and 2014 deported about 500,000 immigrants. And because the program was rolled out community by community, it created this really nice natural experiment where you could see what happened to the communities that had experienced it and the ones hadn't. You could compare them and see what the overall effect. And what researchers found actually shocked me, it shocked many of them, was that for every 100 immigrants that were deported, you actually ended up with 9 fewer jobs for natives. That's not just temporary, work. That's like 9 jobs permanently gone in this community. And there are many studies that reinforce this finding from all across history, from the Bracero program, studies on the H-2B program, which is like H-1B, but for lower skilled immigrants, studies going all the way back to the Great Depression that all find similar things. And the reason is that immigrants are deeply interwoven into their local economies. And so take the restaurant industry. If you're a restaurant owner and suddenly you lose a big chunk of your workforce to the point where you either have to have higher labor costs and at the same time you have less demand, there's a good chance you have to go out of business altogether. And when you go out of business, that doesn't just hurt the immigrants who are working for you, that also hurts the native-born workers. And so there are all these sort of synchronicities, all of these interconnections that allow immigration to have this positive sum effect. But then as soon as if you rip out the immigrants, then native workers often get caught in the crossfire.
Yeah. So if the research is so consistent, so strong, and makes a lot of sense if you think about it a tiny bit more deeply, why do you think this sentiment persists? Is it just a feeling? Because it persists on both the right and the left. It's not as if the left is fighting back. They don't necessarily advocate mass deportations, but they are also not fighting back against this idea that immigrants take away American jobs.
I think part of the fixation on the economics of immigration is a way for many of people like us, elites, people in the media, to try to find a more materialist explanation for a set of instincts that I think many of us are uncomfortable with. And I think that is actually kind of a tragedy. I think if people oppose immigration or feel strongly about immigration because of certain cultural beliefs or concerns about national identity, it's important to take those concerns seriously. And I think it's actually a problem and even a bit patronizing that we tend to project these sort of more wonky economic concerns onto that.
Yeah. I had a conversation with Representative Richie Torres of New York right after the election, who talked about how a lot of the immigrants in his neighborhood had a surprising amount of anti-undocumented immigrant sentiment. And it made me wonder about, I don't even know how to define this, but sense of chaos, like just a feeling of things not being in control. It's sort of the way people feel about crime. There just seems to be a sense that things have run away and you can't get ahead. It's a vague thing, but it is related to there's just so much out of control and I need someone to stop it.
I actually think that's a really important point. One of the greatest shifts in public opinion on immigration has happened in the last few years, where in 2020, according to Gallup, there were only 28% of Americans said they wanted immigration decreased. 4 years later, that number was 55%. So it had almost doubled. And that is much larger and much faster than even the public opinion shift on something like gay marriage. So this is like a huge, almost unprecedented shift. And as I dug into why, what came up over and over again is this feeling of chaos, this feeling that we are not in control of our own border. And when you actually look at questions about how people feel towards immigrants themselves, they hadn't changed nearly as much. People weren't necessarily anti-immigrant. as much as they felt like the immigration process had gotten out of control and the immigration process was no longer serving the country. And so I think it is really important to distinguish those two things. And I think a lot of the public opinion shift we've seen over the last few years, it isn't about economics. It's really about this sense of control and chaos.
Yeah. So maybe the place to end is this. Have you talked to anyone or done any thinking about how in a situation like this you close the gap? Because we as journalists, it's frustrating to us to know that there is an answer. You know, there's an answer the research has provided. There are truths and facts. And separate from that, there is a perception. So have you thought of or seen anybody talk interestingly about how you bridge a gap like that where people feel one way that is discordant with what the reality is?
Unfortunately, like, you know, any good journalist, I'm not quite as good as the solutions as I am about identifying the problems. But I will say, I think at the root of a lot of this is the fact that there's an underlying scarcity, right? So, like, I think an example of this is housing. Recently, you know, we haven't talked about this in particular, but, you know, J.D. Vance and Donald Trump made a big deal in their campaign about how immigrants were responsible for driving up housing costs. That argument has never held weight in American politics before because it is only over the last decade that housing costs and a housing shortage has become a big problem. When there is material scarcity, people look for a villain. People look for someone to blame. And so I think one answer to, for example, the blaming immigrants for housing costs is to say, well, if we fix the housing shortage such that people don't feel that scarcity, maybe we can avoid some of that. I think the other sort of way I look at this is, in some senses, one of the most pro-immigrant things you could do is reduce the amount of chaos, right? So I think there's actually a sort of middle ground here where you could reduce a lot of the chaos at the border while expanding legal immigration in a way that keeps immigrants coming in, but creates a more orderly process that people feel comfortable with, and you can actually get more positive sentiment as a result. I just think what makes it difficult is the politics are almost perfectly aligned to make that difficult from happening. And it's been, you know, immigration reform is something that politicians have been talking about for more than 20 years now, and it hasn't happened.
Well, that was really helpful. Rogé, thank you so much for joining me today and talking about this.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
This episode was produced by Kevin Townsend and edited by Claudina Bade. Rob Smerciak engineered, and Sarah Krolewski fact-checked. Claudina Bade is the executive producer of Atlantic Audio, and Andrea Valdez is our managing editor. Many thanks to Ali Breland and Rogé Karma for joining me. If you'd like to hear Rogé go even deeper on the research into the economic impact of immigration, you can hear him on another Atlantic podcast called Good on Paper. It's hosted by staff writer Jerusalem Demsis, and that episode is linked in the show notes. I'm Hannah Rosen. Thank you for listening.